And I want to welcome everyone here as well. My name is Nicole Neufeld, and on behalf of the Art Gallery of Guelph, I want to thank you all for joining us for a conversation this evening between Tarah Hogue and Pablo Barrera, moderated by Sally Frater. Of course, as we start our time together, I would like to suggest that we each take a moment of reflection to contemplate the place where we all are individually, even though we're physically dispersed, we are gathering, and the land on which we each live, work, learn, and create. I'm a second-generation Canadian of Eastern European background who has been granted the privileges to live here. And I recognize that I have access that others on this land do not experience. And so because of that, and for many reasons, I think of land acknowledgements as a reminder to confront the ongoing realities that affect us today of colonialism, the conflicts and violences experienced today due to settler colonial power structures. And here at the Art Gallery of Guelph, a cultural institution that's based in deeply colonial methods of representation, I remind myself that we need to continue to resist, rethink, rework the colonial structures underpinning our institutions, the ways that we operate, along with the ways that we operate in the day-to-day world and the impacts this has on people's very real daily realities. Let's also recognize that land acknowledgements are far from being enough, that we need to take concrete action toward reconciliation, and let's do this with intention and gratitude. So here where I am, the place we now call Guelph, Ontario, is on the ancestral lands of the Arawandran people in the Treaty 3 territory and lands of the Mississaugas. This land has a long, rich, deep Indigenous history, and today it's home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and will be for generations to come, of course. I invite you in joining me in offering our respect for our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors, recognizing that we have much work to do to strengthen our relationships with these communities. And let's also offer our respect for the elders of the lands where we are, of the past, present, and future. Let's also create space to listen, to amplify and learn from the stories and memories that live on in these communities, to learn from ways of knowing and knowledge of this world that challenges, questions, and critiques our own. We're here tonight for Cross-Border Dialogues, which is a series of conversations with speakers who work in the cultural sector from Canada and the United States, addressing a range of topics, including the philosophies that inform their work, their methods of engagement, and the role of education and community outreach in their respective practices. This program is organized by Sally Frater and presented by the Art Gallery of Guelph with the support of the Canada Council for the Arts through the Sector Innovation and Development Program and the Guelph Community Foundation. So it is my great honor to offer up some words of introduction for Sally, who again has been the brains, heart, and soul behind this whole series. Sally Frater is the daughter of immigrants from the Caribbean. Curatorially, she is interested in decolonial praxis, space and place, Black and Caribbean diasporas, photography, art of the everyday, and issues of equity and representation in museological spaces. She has curated solo and group exhibitions for institutions such as the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Art Gallery of Guelph, the Ulrich Museum of Art, Glassell School of Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Justina M. Barnaky Gallery at the University of Toronto, Project Row Houses, and Center 3 for Artistic and Social Practice. She is now the Senior Curator and Curatorial Manager at the Remai Modern in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And I'm thrilled to turn it over to Sally.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for your words of introduction and for all of your assistance with staging this speaker series. Tonight, I am joining everyone from Treaty 6 territory, otherwise known as Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, well, where I'm at anyway. I just have one housekeeping note before we begin. If there are questions from viewers, if you could please submit them through the Q&A function, and then we will address them after the course of our conversation. So I will just, after that, I'll just move into things. For tonight's final cross-border dialogues, I'm very pleased to welcome Tarah Hogue and Pablo Barrera, two very thoughtful curators whose practices hold some very interesting points of intersection, namely the deep regard that they hold for community, but also their shared cognizance of the specificities of place and space. So I'm going to begin with everybody's intros, and then we'll just move into things, because I think people have been waiting patiently, and I'm also anxious to stop talking and to turn it over to our guests to hear their very thoughtful kind of contemplations on the practice of curating. So Pablo and Barrera, Remai Modern, joined Oklahoma Contemporary Art Center as the inaugural curatorial fellow before being promoted to associate curator. In 2024, he stepped down from his previous role and was named Adjunct Curator, appointed to the upcoming retrospective Hawk EI 6, or by, Edgar Heap of Birds Honor Song, scheduled to open in spring of 2025. Barrera collaborates with local art communities to produce exhibitions and explore innovative strategies to support formal and informal learning of art. He is committed to raising public awareness of Indigenous artistic practices through generating gallery experiences that invite audiences of all backgrounds to engage with art. He has independently curated shows in London, Seoul, and New York. Barrera's achievements include being among the first cohort of curators at Next Haven Art Space in Connecticut, and serving as graduate advisor for Yale University Art Gallery's first student-led Native American art exhibition. He has written on the artistic representation of cultures that experienced colonization, including a co-authored chapter on Korean vernacular architectural heritage in Springer International, and a paper on Mesoamerican art production as part of the Columbian exchange between colonial Spain and East Asia, National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian Institute. Barrera holds master's degrees from Yale University in the history of art and Harvard University Regional Studies, East Asia, and a bachelor's from the University of Pennsylvania, history of art. He is a Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow in 2012 and a Fulbright Scholar in 2011. Barrera was born in Chicago to immigrant parents. His father is a member of the Remai Modern community near Mazamitla in Jalisco, Mexico, where Pablo spent his formative years. Pablo is a first-generation high school, college, and grad school graduate, and he works to amplify the invaluable role Indigenous artistic perspectives contribute towards globalizing the arts. And Tarah Hogue is a curator, writer, and cultural worker based in Treaty 6 and 7 territories and the homeland of the Métis in what is now known as Canada. Working alongside artists and communities, she curates to nurture knowledge, relationships, and the emergence of otherwise worlds. Her practice often attends to the complexities of place, movement, and migration, and indigeneity through collaborative and conciliatory approaches. Currently, Hogue serves as the Adjunct Curator Indigenous Art at Remai Modern in Saskatoon, where her curatorial and institutional efforts are focused on supporting Indigenous self-determination. Two recent curatorial projects include the group exhibition, Storied Objects, Métis Art in Relation, which was curated with advisor Sherry Farrell-Rassett, which received a 2023 AAMC Award for Excellence, and the Mid-Career Survey, Adrian Stimson, Manipukaini. Hogue has authored catalog essays for artists such as Maureen Grubin, Tanya Willard, Henry Sang, and Jinmi Yoon, and her writing has been published in C Magazine, Canadian Art, the Capilano Review, and elsewhere. Hogue is Red River Métis, as well as having white settler ancestry. So welcome to you both. So,
hi, thanks, Sally.
right, so we can just get into the first question. I'm wondering if you could please both share, and Tara, perhaps we'll start with you. If you could please share what your introduction to art was. Like, did you have a family who took you to galleries and museums? Or, and actually, I'll stop with that part of the question.
Sure. I definitely grew up in a creative family who appreciated and practiced many art forms, I would say. And that was a much more sort of normalized part of my upbringing than, say, sports were. We don't have a wealth of galleries and museums in Red Deer, where I was raised. But my mom has a home-based business where she researches and reproduces antique needlepoint samplers, as they're called. And that brought me into a few textile rooms in museums in the US and Europe as a kid. And I definitely didn't have an affinity for that art form, but it did give me an early introduction into one aspect of working in museums. And I think that was kind of a more unconscious influence than anything else, because I really stumbled into art history almost by surprise when I did. And, you know, it was only later through experiencing great exhibitions and making friends with artists that made me realize that I wanted to be a curator. So.
Thank you. And Pablo, how about you?
Yeah, similar. I did not grow up with a lot of access to galleries. You would think that I would, having been born in Chicago, but I was there in my youth and it was never really considered to be a welcoming space, especially for minoritized populations, and particularly because English was not a strong suit with my family growing up. So we didn't really feel like we had access to, I guess, the more sort of market-driven and academic-driven side of art making and creative works. However, in my culture, very similar to you, Tara, we had a lot of art making in our family. It's a big part of our culture. A lot of like the sort of like yarn paintings for the nerikas that we use for ceremony and altars. A lot of beadwork, like you know, a lot of people call gourd stitch also peyote stitch, and that comes from the peyote cultures, which is where I'm from. And so I grew up surrounded by art most of my life on all sides, not only from the indigenous side of my father's side, but also even the Christian side of my mother's Spanish heritage. So I was very well aware of through churches, those kind of devotional works, as well as the devotional works that I saw through, I guess you can call it devotional, through ceremonial objects, and also through just adornment, and even just the kind of art that we gifted each other and that we created to commemorate each other. So I was aware of art. It just took a while before I started to see it within a gallery context, probably beginning in high school with like school trips to museums, and then later on in life when I met people who were exhibiting or folks who were more aware of how museum context and gallery context worked. So that was a bit of a late start in terms of figuring out the art field from a Western perspective.
Okay. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. So from those early beginnings, what was it that led you to the decision to become an art curator? And we'll go with you, Pablo, since.
Sure. Yeah. I think, oh boy, I think with curation, it was really more just having such a deep respect for artists. I think when I first moved to New York on a whim, really, just kind of exploring in my youth to figure out my life, I met a lot of artists in Brooklyn that were kind of forging their path ahead, especially through Pratt Institute, and also just some emerging artists like in Queens and Manhattan. And that really was eye-opening for me. I got to see people who were engaging this very different side of art making than I was used to. I was used to more being a cultural product or being something affiliated with your belief systems. But the way that it was this interesting intellectual exercise opened my eyes to how the visual language could be articulated in a manner that was almost translatable to Western audiences. And I started to reflect better on the value that I inherently held for my culture and the art that came from my culture. So as opposed to seeing it as something that was ineffable to audiences that were not part of my culture, I began to see the value in interrogating things through the visual language. And that really kind of opened my eyes because especially when you get away from English and you just start looking at visual material, there's a lot that can be said that I think doesn't fall into the trappings of jargon or even like some of the particular statements that are more of a trend within the field at certain periods of time. So that was very freeing, just kind of seeing it from that perspective. But the more I looked into it, the more I recognized that as much as I was able to dabble in things like painting, printmaking, woodwork, sculpture, even installation work, it just really, ceramics even, I don't think I could call myself an artist because I didn't have the same intensity of rigor for the creation of the works as I did for something that was either directly related to my culture or talking about it to an English speaking audience. And so with that recognition, I began to realize that my strength lay more in the interrogation of what it meant that these works existed. And through that process, I started thinking about exhibitions more critically. It was really more watching these artists try to grapple with their place within these gallery settings and museum settings that got me thinking about that interesting, I don't want to call it like a gatekeeping, but I guess it could be seen that way sometimes. But there was definitely a linchpin figure, the curator, that negotiated and moderated a lot of conversations between artists and institution. And that became intriguing for me. And the more I explored that, the more I recognized that I needed to educate myself more so on that side of art history. And that's what led me towards my degrees.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love hearing everyone's story about how they fall into the practice, right? You know, I started out in college as an English major while my close friends went into their visual arts degrees. And I dropped out of visual arts class in high school. I like also, you know, enjoyed dabbling, but I could never finish a project on time. And writing was something that I had an aptitude for. And so I started off as an English major. And, you know, I took the Art History 101 course, and that course at the local college was taught by like not a progressive modernist, but he was an amazing storyteller. And so I, you know, immediately could see the potential or the promise in that space of telling stories about history, about culture through objects, in language. And it was a way that I could connect with what, you know, my peers were doing, but just not through that same practice-based entry point. And I always really wanted to take visual arts classes, but the schools that I went, the undergrads, I went to Queen's, they didn't offer visual arts classes to art history students. I took one performance art class with Clive Robertson, which was really a lot of fun. But it was while I was at Queen's, and I was a docent at the Agnes. And Richard William Hill, who's a Cree curator, was touring an exhibition from the Banff Center called The World Upside Down. And that was the exhibition that introduced me to many artists who continue to influence me today, like Shelley Nero, Laurie Blondo, Terrence Houle, Yinka Shanabare, General Idea. And the premise of the exhibition was sort of sparked by the drawings in the, you know, borders of illuminated manuscripts, where the world is topsy-turvy and peasants are served by nobility, and rabbits are hunting hunters. And so this sort of artistic upending of the social order was brought together so beautifully in this group of works that Richard brought together. And that was the first time that I had an opportunity to work with Indigenous artists who were circulating in that gallery system. And it was such a spark, you know, when I was at Queen's, there weren't Indigenous faculty that I was able to study with. You know, I studied with Linda Jessup, who's an art historian that teaches about Indigenous art histories, and I took women's studies courses, as it was called then, and sort of, you know, began to expand my horizons in that way. And that was really the point at which I understood that rather than writing about art or speaking about other people's work, which is, you know, still something we do as curators, but there was another way to enter into relationship with artists and be in dialogue and be supporting their work in that way. So that's sort of what took me into curatorial studies eventually.
So you touched on this a little bit in terms of what your experience was in undergrad at Queen's. When you decided to move into curating, what are some of the things that you did to prepare for doing this work? Whether it was deciding to go on to further post-secondary study or interning to, I guess, being in dialogue with artists more frequently? Like, what were some of the things that you decided to do?
Yeah, well, I applied to the curatorial studies program at UBC after I graduated from Queen's, and I didn't get in. But that, like the last semester that I was in undergrad, I had gone on a trip to Vancouver to visit some friends who were studying at Emily Carr. And I was like, oh my God, it's so beautiful here. Why haven't I been living on the West Coast all along? And so I moved out there and ended up opening an independent art space with 3 other women. And we operated that for 10 years in Vancouver. And, you know, of course, that was, if you want to learn how artists think about making exhibitions, that was, you know, a great entry point into that. I also, volunteered at artist run centers and was a docent at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And so when I reapplied, they realized that I was serious and let me into the program the next time.
Pablo, do you have any?
Yeah, I'm reflecting now on my own trepidation entering the field as well, given the way that it was taught and given the kind of languages that were used to discuss art. I also had a lot of trouble seeing myself within the field according to the parameters that were established in academia or particular programs, and I didn't really have any curators that I admired. I wasn't lucky enough to run yet. I would later, and they would become immense mentors, but at the time when I was really starting off, I saw the role that the curator played, but I didn't really see anyone that was doing it in a way that I felt was in line with my own cultural understanding, that was going to open the door or the path forward for that kind of thinking or that kind of perspective. I just saw a lot of sort of demand to mold yourself into a very specific way of thinking about art and curation. And I resisted it. You know, I probably shouldn't have as much as I have. And, you know, there's always something good about creating distance and learning things from a different perspective. But I think just at that time, I was very adamant about trying to sort of do things in a different way. And I also took this step towards just opening up a kind of like art collective independent space in Korea, of all places, just which happened through happenstance, through different programs and research projects and just random research-based trips that just ended up and, you know, crossing paths with the right people at the right time. It was through that space where I really began to grapple with what I was most concerned with, which is this idea that the artists that I'm interested in giving and helping and supporting are operating from an Indigenous perspective in a very colonial context. And Korea gave me the opportunity to really get far away, literally to the other side of the planet, of people experiencing the same thing. You have this country that today is split in two because of colonial forces that is still really much grappling through the ramifications of colonial modernity, as people call it, which has now been debunked in different ways of like being seen as the only way forward for certain countries and certain cultures. There is just a lot of this love for their thousands of years of history, but almost like insecurity in a global stage with how it would mesh with modernization. And that really kind of let me get a foothold with talking to artists and expressing what it is that we wanted to see in a gallery space, and ended up finding a very interesting location, which is like a preservation zone in the middle of the city, which is where a bunch of basically radical thinkers and aristocrats were quarantined during Japanese colonization, and then ended up becoming like a Hanok village, like it's called Puchon, Hanok Maor, and basically that place is just like, and now it's not quite living up to its interesting history. It's really more seen as an interesting tourist trap, but there's such a deep, rich story there that I felt like a lot of folks are not aware of. And the gallery kind of created a very interesting disruption in that space. It was a place called Kilburn Art Space that allowed folks to pause and look at vernacular architecture and go, oh, I usually see these as outdated. I see these as a thing of the past. I see these as like almost like a thing to preserve, but not necessarily engage with in a very critical way now. And then they were looking at something that they did see that was, you know, contemporary art that they could do that with, but in that space. And so that clashing of place and space and that tension between this very well-preserved Hanok in particular, surrounded by all this like interest in modernization and westernization, I think really kind of generated a lot of conversations and let people bring their stories into the space and start to engage it very differently. And that felt very successful. And that's what really got me thinking that, hey, there's something to this curation thing that is a way to support artists and is a way to help them and is a way to kind of give, you know, some voice or even lend some support to get that voice amplified and heard, and even to reach out to community and to get them to engage with those voices and kind of skirt around some of the parameters that are established by academia or by the formal settings of a gallery. And I say that very harshly, but really like nowadays, I know there's more of a turn towards being more community focused and being better at outreach and being better at public, you know, general knowledge and even public engagement with gallery spaces and museums and institutions. But at the time, it really did feel like it was a little bit more of a specialized knowledge that was being managed carefully by particular cultural tastemakers. And I recognized that there was this dearth of engagement with community. And through that kind of interesting 4-year project of just having the space every summer and winter to kind of get people to come together, I began to see that there was something there worth exploring and probing. Because of the way that my education was set up, I didn't really get to pivot into a curatorial studies program. They were still kind of thin on the ground, and they weren't really developing to the level that they are now. There was still sort of like a nascent moment in the, you know, early aughts. And so therefore, and I was still making up my mind in terms of what I wanted to do. So I kind of missed the boat on a couple things there. But eventually I would run into folks that I admired and that I would then be able to say, aha, this is the person I want to not necessarily emulate, but engage and figure out a little bit more about what this whole curatorial thing is about.
You have both touched on, this idea of collaboration and community engagement. And I'm hoping that you can speak about that a little bit further in a moment. But what I will ask you to sort of reflect on right now is to think about moving into, you both started out in spaces that you created yourselves, and being in collaboration with communities. Tarah, you mentioned working with, was it 3 other women or 4 other women to start your space. And so I'm wondering, when you moved from that into more of a, you know, sort of formalized kind of institutional type of setting, were there ways of working that you found jarring, or were you able to carry forth some of the ways in which you were used to working? Your introduction into staging exhibitions, et cetera, were you able, how did that kind of knowledge and those practices, those protocols move into those spaces with you? Or could they?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think after we opened the GAM Gallery, which was what it was called, that was a space where we had shared studios, a small gallery in the front, and really to sort of reflecting the collective of women who opened the space, who came from sort of multi-arts backgrounds. We engaged in a lot of different kinds of activities in the space, community markets, live music, workshops, exhibitions, a little bit of everything, partially to keep the doors open and make sure that we were paying rent, but also because, that was our space to create what we wanted to. And we had different ideas about that, but it was, this sort of open enough framework that was possible. When I went to grad school, I think that experience prepared me in a different way than the students that were in the program who had come sort of purely through academic streams. And the program at UBC is small, and they bring folks into that program from a variety of backgrounds. So it is like interesting in that way, because you have a bunch of different perspectives coming together to think through approaches to curating. So it was kind of this sort of multivocality is sort of built into the program in a lot of ways. But the fact that I had already had a history of working alongside and thinking alongside artists really made a big difference. But the other thing was, for me, that I had been lucky enough to have work study positions in undergrad and then in grad school as well. And the program at UBC is quite an academic curatorial studies program. There is still a practicum, and we had a couple of opportunities to curate exhibitions in the program, like collectively or in our sort of graduate project. But having an opportunity to work in the university art gallery while I was in school was like an education that was just as important as the academic side of things. And I was very fortunate and very supported in the program in that way. And my mentor was a Japanese Canadian woman named Naomi, who is the head of the public programs and communications there, and had a history of involvement with the Japanese Canadian redress movement, and had a history of herself being a racialized woman working in art galleries and museums. So I felt like I had a good support system in moving into that space. I think that in my experience as an early career curator, the things that I had to learn were like less immediately jarring and more about the ways that the institution can co-opt community or cultural knowledge in ways that are quite subtle, and in ways that you may not always be as attuned to when you are a young person who is excited about the opportunity to share those things that you're bringing with you. Sally, I feel like we've had conversations about this recently. So For me, that was, that in the early part of my career, that was the kind of ongoing learning that I needed to do, to really understand the spaces that we are inviting artists into, and what our responsibilities are as racialized or Indigenous people working in these places. Yeah, so I'll pass it over to Pablo.
This is this really is something that resonates, I think, with my own personal journey as well in becoming a curator. And that's where I know that it sounds like I'm kind of bashing academia, which is like, not fair, because I've gained a lot through being part of that process. There's some things that academia does really well. They're very good at generating a sustainable kind of like system based on very almost glacial based introspection and rigor to produce results that then become very, very foundational, moving forward. It doesn't move as fast as I think, our own human lifetimes would like it to be, but it does move, and it does require people to come in and kind of inject perspective, as you noted, Tara. And therefore it benefits the most when you have that diversity of voice to start to kind of erode at the sort of compartments in which it performs. Right. So it's I've been very irreverent about these boundaries. It's very academic, can be very siloed. Institutional museum studies can also be very siloed. But there's always something really kind of wonderful that happens when those boundaries start to become a bit more porous, or they start to erode just a little bit. And the artist kind of flows through those spaces, and the artwork itself does as well. And the curator gets to kind of, help that along and also wrangle it in for, whatever's best for the project. And that kind of push and pull and that understanding of the boundaries and that, sort of ability to both pay respect to, but also question whether those boundaries should be there is really something that I think I definitely carried forward, much as you mentioned, Tara, from these experiences of being in spaces that you got to just create with people collaboratively. So that freedom to create and that freedom to generate something on the ground like that certainly gave me a taste for the creative side of curation and the way that you can question and challenge how things are, where you can see for what they are, but also see how they could be. And then to bring that to the table is really something that kind of stayed with me throughout the entire process of my, my work and my experience in my career. I was very fortunate because I think when I first started as a fellow, I was working under Jennifer Scanlon, who's now a director in St. Louis, the Museum of Craft over there. And she was just very open to ideas. She knew that it was a very small team at Oklahoma Contemporary. And in a lot of ways that was bad because, you don't have as much people to kind of advocate and work together. But on the other hand, you had a lot more freedom, and then you get to reach out to community and have them come into the spaces to help you advocate for a curatorial vision. And so that was a great resonance and a great, compatibility in terms of what I was doing before, what I could do when I entered the space from an institutional level. And then, of course, after a while, you start to kind of adapt. You start to learn how to navigate the administrative side of curation. You start to understand all the different departmental needs that start to kind of pull away at the kind of like spontaneity of creativity, because you got to have a little bit of predictability in order to ensure funding and to ensure success and to better support. And so that kind of tempering really, came in at the right pace, I think, and still allowed me to continue to, especially in a place like Oklahoma, to think about community and to think about the people that I was working with. I think it really helped that despite having done these other projects and despite, interning in certain places and despite, doing volunteer work and even just like doing some small, kind of research projects and goals with other institutions, I think it helped that when I really started to cut my teeth as a professional, it was in a state that was used to being sort of like kind of left on its own devices, and therefore welcomed fresh ideas and welcomed anything that would invigorate and maybe even kind of challenge the status quo, because Oklahoma is used to being the victim of like geographical chauvinism in the United States, so to speak, and so therefore we don't really feel as beholden to the rules and the systems in play that benefit particular institutional settings, because we don't really get the full benefits anyway. So why be so reverent, in that sense? And I think that really helped being in a space like this that already by its own history is meant to kind of challenge what we think we understand about the narratives that we tell ourselves about a particular institutional setting or even historical setting. And so that definitely gave a lot of ground for me to pull in this creative flow of let's bring in people, let's bring in community, let's bring in other voices, let's think about, and also the need, right? You know, there was less support, less people, so we have to, by force, reach out. We have to work together. We're a little vulnerable in that way. And I think that that really kind of lent itself well to me sort of finding a way to sustainably incorporate that into my practice as a curator. And now I think it's a much more welcome setting for that kind of thinking. And it's exciting to hear, Tarah, how you were developing this as it was nascent before it really became like sort of more sort of the call to think about community, to think about space and place when doing curation work. How your experience is very similar to mine, had a lot to do with just working on the ground with the people that were there in order to get something to happen that we felt was important. And I myself really relied on collaboration with local community in order to see that vision through and to let them have a stake and let them have buy-in into whatever projects are going on. Otherwise, it just becomes a didactic presentation where it's just very top down, where I just make something and say, here you go. And then they have to either accept or reject. It became much more fruitful and much more spontaneous and much more organic in that sense. And I learned a lot through that process on how to translate that in an institutional setting with all the different parameters at play. And I think academia helped me with that a lot too, because as a graduate student, you really have to navigate all these really kind of strict structures. It can be a little feudalistic in some ways, but when you learn to do that effectively, those tools translate very well into other forms of grappling with you know, sort of like the way things are and have been and the way things could be and how to steer that ship in that direction. So that really was helpful, I think. I think the timing was very lucky. The opportunity presented itself and I just happened to be ready and I grabbed onto it. And Tarah, it sounds similar that you just kind of built your own preparation so that when the opportunity knocked, you were able to come in and bring it to the table, and thankfully people were receptive. And now in hindsight are able to see that that was definitely the right decision.
I mean, timing is such a funny part of it because, you know, I've like given or been part of enough conversations like this where you're talking about the formation of your practice that it almost becomes this, you know, fait accompli kind of story. Like, of course I ended up here, all of the stars aligned to get me there, but it does really feel like that sometimes.
Yeah.
When I was in grad school, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was traveling across the country and having all of these hearings, listening to the terrible experiences of survivors of the residential school system. And the Belkin Art Gallery decided to undertake one of the first sort of major exhibitions focused on work by artists who had a substantial aspect of their practice to be focused on grappling with that experience, representing it, what that means. And so that project, which I stayed on at the Belkin to do after I had graduated, brought me into relationship with a community of thinkers, scholars, and artists, and survivors and community members connected to the campus, which is on Musqueam territory, in such a, you know, profound way that it has shaped the rest of my practice and the way that I approach thinking about collaboration and community engagement. And the way that we did it in that exhibition was far from perfect. And you know, this was a moment when things began to shift in very big ways in Canada with the release of the final report of the TRC and the recommendations that came with that. So we were doing that work. You know, the institution was trying to do that work sort of right at the beginning of that moment in history. And yeah, so there were things that could be done better, but good things to learn from certainly. But just that idea of, you know, the way that the stars kind of align to get you into that place, and trusting that, and sort of trying to be attentive to that moment that you're in is important too, I think.
And trusting the people that lead you there, right, Tara? I think there's a lot of people that believe in what energy you bring and what ideas you're bringing to the table, and having them just sort of invest that kind of support and just sort of like give you the floor to do something, and then just hopefully being ready to jump on that floor and get to work. You know, it's it is a lot of it feels a lot of, like you said, the stars aligning. But like I said, if you define luck as opportunity meeting preparedness, then obviously there's a big part of like being prepared, you know, doing some work and recognizing the value of the voices that you've been talking to and how they should be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
One of the things that occurred to me while you were both responding to that question in these really thoughtful ways is that when you're doing any sort of curatorial study, it's become cliche, right? That the term curator, it originally was someone who was a steward of a collection, et cetera, et cetera. And so this notion of care is introduced at the very beginning, but it's not really developed in academic settings. Like we don't really talk about what that means. And it seems as though I have many thoughts. And so I'm just going to say them, and then you can respond to any thread if you feel like it, or the thing that you wish I had said. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that when people are working from certain cultural positions, let's say, there is a sense of obligation. There's a sense of obligation that I think that not everyone carries forward. And it's really interesting because it's often through the things that go wrong that we begin to adjust, you know, how we actually perform care, which means I think the way in which we think about the work that we do as curators shifts. And I'm wondering if you can speak about that a little bit. We don't really talk about it, sort of implied, the kind of values that we bring forward. You have both obviously touched on this in terms of, you know, working with community, learning things that have worked, things that haven't worked. And so I guess my question that's coming out of this is, one, if there's anything that you'd like to add to that, but then also, as we're realizing these things in real time, and sometimes some of us are fortunate enough to have mentors who will really kind of reinscribe that lesson for us. How is it that we kind of bring that forward in terms of mentoring that we might be performing ourselves? So this is like a very kind of convoluted question, but you know.
Maybe I'll pick it up just because I was talking about the lessons that we learned through that exhibition. And I've been thinking a lot about it because I've been writing a book chapter for like the last 2 years on this exhibition, and doing that in conversation with others who contributed to like laying the groundwork for that exhibition, which was a very significant moment in the institution's history, and was part of a longer trajectory of, and I would say, deep forms of engagement with Indigenous artists and community members. But when you're working on an exhibition about residential schools, and you are inviting artists with lived experience of trauma, with intergenerational trauma, you know, the institution, many of the folks who were working in that, you know, small university art gallery were right on par with the rest of Canadians learning about this for the first time. And so there was no way that they could be prepared to care for folks in the ways that they needed to. And we had a really great curatorial group. There was like 7 of us that worked on the exhibition. And then we had a number of advisors, including like Bobby Joseph from Reconciliation Canada, and Alvin Dixon from the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and Leona Sparrow from Musqueam, and like a lot of people who really gave us some very important foundational guidance, particularly around the need to show resilience and joy and healing, at the same time as, you know, being situated on a university campus. We were part of the larger effort to try to educate students and faculty members on this history. You know, it wasn't a space for Indigenous folks. It wasn't a space for survivors, that they weren't the first audience. You know, so there were aspects of care for artists or support workers, that the institution just didn't like have the capacity for. And I know that there were things that could have been possible through programming that Naomi, who I mentioned before, was really interested in pursuing, that weren't able to happen just because of resources and time, and, you know, all of these sorts of things. And so that was, you know, that has been many years of reflecting on an experience that was very foundational for me and brought me into this, into relationship with a community that, you know, as I said, is still very much part of my life. And so I think it is, you know, it is a case of not always being able to anticipate the way that our work can harm others, especially when we're in a process of learning about how to do the work, you know, institutions and as individuals. And in terms of the mentorship aspect of your question, Sally, that experience was a really positive one for me, because I started off on the project as a curatorial intern, and was credited as a co-curator of the project. And so played a lot of support role in researching artists, and but then was very much empowered by the collective to contribute to decision making. And so they brought me into the fold in a way that was very supportive, and didn't feel sort of hierarchical or prescriptive. And so that is really sort of the way that I've tried to approach mentorship within my own work, is to think about reciprocal learning. And oftentimes that is also my approach to collaboration, is to invite people into dialogue with me that I am like excited to learn alongside, and, you know, hopefully offer them something as well. Yeah. Pablo, what about you?
Yeah, I think I want to jump back on that idea of curation and its relationship to the word to care. You know, it was funny when I was talking about my background and even thinking about how we just kind of made the space because it didn't exist. In essence, I was kind of putting on the hat of a curator, right? I was just saying, I'm a curator now. And that's no different than lots of folks that overuse that term, you know, like much to the chagrin of the field, right? Where like a lot of folks just say, I curated this, or I curated that, you know, it tends to be a very overused term. But I think if we go back to that original terminology of like, you know, coming from the word to care for something, I think it's great to reflect on, well, what do we care about when we say we're a curator, right? Some people care about the likes they get on a particular social media platform. Some people care about the proximity to certain structures of power that they, or culture, or even cultural cachet that they get from calling themselves a curator. But you're describing a situation where you are in proximity to a community that you felt obligated towards. And I think that's an important thing too, right? Where when you are a curator in the old school sense of taking care of a collection, you are feeling, in a sense of duty towards the people who helped you get the collection, the people who help you maintain the collection, and the people who value it at the level of resources and at the level of, like, museum patrons and things like that. So therefore, like, I could see how that then steers the way you care about a particular art object. However, when you're focused on community, that is not normally present within those acquisition structures. All of a sudden, you have a different series of obligations and priorities that are there. You start to think more carefully about voice. You start to think more carefully about the collateral effects of what it is that you're working on. And I think I ran into that quite a lot. To go back to that space that I talked about in Korea, one of the hardest lessons I learned there was how even when you're trying to set up a great argument, you can only really focus on one argument at a time. And then there's all these other great arguments that demand that there's almost like a series, or maybe even like a, another, like, follow up to the space. And that really is what kept me pushing. It was supposed to just be a one-time thing. And then what happened was that we opened a space because I had the argument of, well, all you people keep insisting that Western modernization is so great, but look at this wonderful culture that you have sitting right in the middle of your own city. That's like by the Blue House next to downtown Seoul. It's like this massively interesting location. And you're even trying to tear down some of the buildings there to replace them with like concrete structures with like a cap that looks like the vernacular structures, but then you can actually use the whole thing. You don't have to destroy it and then like replace it and then just like do like Disney World where it's like a facade, right? You can actually engage the whole thing, and it's just as valuable and it's just as interesting, and it's your culture. And you should have that. That's not something that you need to have switched out or to look down on because the rest of the world doesn't care. And so that really opened up a lot of ISIS of people. But what really struck me was the number of people who wanted to talk about the history of that particular location, where, because it wasn't in the books, there wasn't a lot of teaching about it. I learned a lot from folks that just go, my relatives know about this place. My grandparents from like back in the early 1900s, like elderly people would be coming and say like, this is where they used to put people who were considered to be a bit too unable to assimilate, like that had some kind of cultural status that made it to where you couldn't just execute them. But they, were wealthy and they were from connected families, and they needed to be kind of quarantined to have some kind of control when Japan was taking over the peninsula. And therefore, there's a lot of trauma that was associated with the space. And so that informs this idea of like, well, let's just raise it to the ground and start over. It's like, it's not even that old. It's only like a couple 100 years old. We have some things that are from the 1500s. Like, why are we bothering with this thing? It's a painful past. But then they were talking about how it opened their eyes to the fact that even though it's a more recent structure, it's rooted in this like deep hurt that's connected to a pride that's related to thousands of years of history and what's going to happen in the future. And so they were grateful, but that opened my eyes to like, well, the next exhibition needs to be different. The next themes need to look a little different. Maybe we need to think about having speakers. Maybe we need to think about having more celebratory elements in here, like bringing in performers, things like programming, for example. Then like, now I got to write some grants. And so it just became this situation where the sense of obligation continued to increase the more I engaged the community, because it turned out that even though I was addressing a certain element of the community, I was missing another portion of the community once they started to come together. And that was more meaningful, and that was much more profound than what I could have possibly come up by myself, and what I could have possibly come up with whatever information was at the moment available. It really became truly holistic based upon that collaboration. And that really opened up my ideas on what it means to care, and what it means to take on that role as a curator and to care about the topics deeply enough to engage them, and then therefore by force improve upon your methods. And even though it was successful, and even though we didn't insult anybody, if anything, we opened the door for great conversation, and people felt grateful and very warm towards this space. And even my own presence in that space became like a great cultural exchange where I got to talk about my issues with like colonization. And they got to say, oh, I didn't know that about America. That's amazing. I didn't know that about Mexico. That's incredible. And so that became really wonderful to see how these cultures were able to talk to each other. And yet so that was like not really like making mistakes and stumbling my way into like harsh lessons. It actually became this moment of like, well, what can we do this better? How can we improve, right? How can we continue to, even though we hit the nail on the head, there are other nails. And we can do more. We can improve on this. We can improve the hammers. We can really start to just to belabor the metaphor. Just really kind of push what it is that we're trying to accomplish to whole new heights. And that's when I started to recognize that there's an ecosystem of different art spaces that curators can inhabit, as well as artists, that go anywhere from like these experimental spaces to more established market galleries to artists in residence, to studio spaces, to institutional spaces, and that working together as a constellation, you get a better picture, and you probably have a more complete system in place to where the slower moving institutional settings are kind of being prodded by these much more quick and more fleet-footed experimental spaces. But then those experimental spaces are also aware that they have to kind of think about sustainable processes as well, and then eventually become their own institutions, you know, kind of in a sense. And so it's like kind of an interesting cycle that occurs when you let these different elements come together in place. So there's room for the different models that we do things, as long as we're willing to talk to each other and discourse, as you described, Tara. And I think that that's an important lesson as a curator, is that you never stop learning, and you never can have enough voices in the room. You're really more just distilling, and you're really more just moderating all these different elements. And then it's just a matter of what you want to center within a particular curatorial vision of a particular exhibition that you're making, and who are the people that are going to help you make it, or who are the voices that are going to be central to the process of making that particular experience. And that's something you only really learn through mentorship, as you mentioned. And mentorship and curation, I feel, go very much hand in hand, precisely because it needs to be intergenerational. I feel personally that I lacked a lot of guidance in the beginning, but it appeared through trial and error. And I think when I was at Penn, we had, for example, Robert Storr came to speak on Josh Mosley, who was a professor at Penn, who was in the 2007 Biennale. Which is the one that I actually got to see for the first time through a seminar that I took over there. So we had like Robert Storr and Josh Mosley like talking to each other in a room, and you would think that, oh, Robert Storr, I'm going to emulate this guy, but I wasn't really fully convinced yet. You know, I was just still like, I don't know what's going on, but I liked some of the things I saw, and I just kind of was just kind of plucking away at it as I was learning on the go. And then it wasn't until after I've done these projects and after I entered certain spaces and became a grad student and had some experience under my belt that I met my mentor, Gabrielle Tyack of the Piscataway Nation, now based in Washington, D.C. At the time, she was working at the National Museum of American Indian Smithsonian at the NMAI, and was doing incredible work, really more in the history research section, but still curating and still working with curatorial projects. And it's almost like she was able to look through what I had done and kind of be like, oh, you kind of sleptwalk through these things. Let me give you some context about what I see that you were doing intuitively correct, but how you could have done it better. And that was so valuable. That was such an incredible moment, because it was almost like she was trying to correct the record, to be like, well, this is the mentorship you should have had at these particular moments. And then through her guidance, it's like, well, this is where you should go if you want to continue down this path to get the kind of mentorship that you're going to need in order to move forward, as somebody who herself had to kind of figure things out on the fly, and even go through a very different route in terms of her education to end up in curation. And so that was kind of wonderful and just eye-opening and incredible and very crucial at that moment, when I was like kind of just hitting a plateau, to meet somebody who was like, oh, I've been here and I was there decades before you started. So now I see where you are, and I can tell you what should have been there for you and what should carry forward. And that really informed my own mentorship, where I try to be the kind of mentor that I wish I would have had when I was in those particular spaces. And I try to think creatively about, well, what is this person at right now? What are their experiences? What do they have in their toolkit? What do I feel would be useful to add to that toolkit? How can I offer that to them? And how can I kind of give them the guidance that I would have appreciated had I been in that position? So you start to shift the care towards the next generation of curators, and you start to think about them as future collaborators, and you start to think about training them to also enter these multi-community and multi-locale and just like multivalent ways of approaching exhibition making that, you know, are obviously what's really informing my current practice. And it sounds like yours as well, Tara. And I think what a lot of people struggle to articulate, that is probably at the core of successful curation. I think we just haven't put this much attention on the community aspect as we have the individual. And I think that is the effect of like certain types of westernized thinking. But if you really start to look back, you start to see that there is like a nexus, there is a context, there is a community of even just thinkers that are present for all successful curators that we admire. And there's even like particular networks that they benefited from that have put them in platforms to be admired for the work they do. And so now I think we're starting to recognize that there's a lot more components to that. And that as a curator, you're simultaneously helping articulate some of this, and then you're also thinking about people following your footsteps and how to make that path more clear versus more obscured with like some of the shall we say more individual centric approaches to curation.
Yeah. What I think was really interesting about your response was that you turned to the time that you spent in Korea and how it informed all of these different aspects of not only how you approached the work that you did while you were there, but some of the work that you did subsequently afterwards. And Tara, I'm wondering if you can speak a bit. You also have spent time abroad. You worked in New Zealand and in Australia, and I'm wondering if you can touch on that a little bit, about how those experiences informed your approaches to curating.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think that those moments of travel have been so formative to my understanding of the global Indigenous as a community that I participate in, as a space where we build solidarity and learn from one another across contexts that are resonant but distinct from our own. And I would include the sort of cross-border context of the US and Canada, in that I have not had the fortune of spending very much time in Mexico. But that cross-border context is one that is obviously still so present and has such an impact on a number of Indigenous communities. My own nation, we're at the borderlands as the US-Canada border was being formed, and we're negotiating with two nation states and First Nations kin, and that is, they were at the center of that beginning of the formation of these national identities and the way that they were distinctly positioned against one another in terms of racial ideologies and ideas of belonging and of indigeneity itself, right? So I think that maybe the experience that I would reflect on most is being invited into a curatorial collective at the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane by my dear friend Leuli Ashragi, who I used to sit on the board of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective with. And that was a wonderful way of being invited in to work in a context that I was unfamiliar with, because there was that relationship of trust already established. And that project led to, two other exhibitions, one in Aotearoa, and then the final iteration at the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was called Transits and Returns, which was really about these experiences of being in place and being in movement as the kind of complex and the sort of circulation between those two things as being so formative to Indigenous experience in the contemporary world, and how artists grapple with that tension, and how we traverse borders all the time in the work that we do. And certainly the space of the Indigenous is a privileged space, but it is also one where we sort of curate ourselves into being in relationship with one another and dialogue with one another, while also honoring and learning from our differences. And a lot of the things that I'm saying are found in writing by David Garneau, who is, one of my mentors and someone whose thought has really impacted the way that I approach this work. But when you travel, you carry home with you. You carry that lived experience and history and inheritances with you in your body, and you encounter others in the world with that, and those experiences interface and intermingle, and ideally when you return home, you bring something of that experience back with you. And certainly at the Vancouver Art Gallery, when transits and returns opened, and we had this group of 20 Indigenous artists all from throughout the Great Ocean in that space, we had all sorts of community members come through that had never been to the gallery before, like lots of people from Samoa, and it just opened up another kind of space in the museum. And so, there's obviously been a long history of those kinds of intercultural exchanges. And in Canada, we've had the Tri-Nation Exchange, which was with Australia and New Zealand a number of years ago. So I think Indigenous folks have been building those networks and relationships for a long time. And they are really, well, and they go back much farther to, some of like the early, some of the early actions for land rights and recognition, on the international stage. And in Canada, we're implementing UNDRIP, and museums are grappling with what it means to try to support Indigenous self-determination. And all of this sort of comes out of those international frameworks and solidarity movements. So it's an incredibly important and rich space to be engaging with in our work, because it helps us to understand the place where we stand. And Jolene Rickard writes really beautifully and urgently about the need for these kinds of comparative understandings of our places, particularly across the Canada-US border in her context. But
if I could jump on that, Tara, I'm glad that you brought up this idea of determination or self-determination with different nation states and different international communities, especially with different Indigenous nations. Sovereignty is a word that's been kicked around lately in the field. We had discussions of sovereignty with like different Supreme Court cases and different like cases that have to do with like, especially in Oklahoma with Indian territory for like decades now. And this has been an ongoing battle to talk about how to best enact sovereignty. And it's entered the lexicon of curation recently through like the previous Venice Biennale, through that exhibition, titled Sovereignty. And then like, that was the whole theme of the last one before Jeffrey Gibson showed up. And it's interesting too that even in Tulsa, there was Allison Glenn did the Sovereignty or Sovereign Futures, kind of effort to bring together different communities to talk about this term and discuss it in relation to Black and Indigenous solidarity in this region, which is a deep part of the history of this part of the world. And I think that idea of being a good guest, of knowing how to carry what yourself and carry what you've learned in your community forward into another space, to acknowledge the spaces that you're entering, to then engage it in a meaningful way where it's a true cultural exchange and not just extraction, and to really genuinely have that kind of rapport is a way to support the sovereignty of another community, is a way to understand that they have a right to their own space and to defend that space, and that you are entering the space either through invitation or just through chance, and that mode of engagement is a way to basically see those boundaries between you and the other and to choose how to navigate them together. And that ability to choose those boundaries and then forge healthy boundaries and healthy enforcement of those boundaries is something that I think is missing in a lot of these discussions about boundary making and about borders. where these borders are not being determined by people that are looking for collaboration or looking for a way to interface. They're looking for ways to silo and ways to distance. And then therefore that interrupts the natural flow of human movement, which is to engage and which is to use those boundaries as a point of contact. And so I think that you're looking at a boundary that's not determined by the communities that are most affected by it. It's dictated by essentially foreigners in this continent. And then on top of that, you have the people who understand their boundaries and how their circulations occurred. And those are completely being dismissed as a way to sort of think about how they determine their spaces and determine their communities, like the locus of activity of each community. And so I think that I'm glad that sovereignty is entering. I'm a little concerned that the word is being kicked around in a way that's removing it from these very urgent and very practical concerns that do affect the communities at play. I think it's becoming a little bit less so about self-determination and more so about how one liberates oneself. And that's a very interesting conversation to have for sure. But it starts to move away from the community. It starts to become more about the individual sense of place in a system, which I feel is less revolutionary so much as it is just an articulation of that system. And so because it's an English word, it's going to be laden with colonial tendencies. It's going to be fraught, in that regard. And this is why returning it back to community and having that sort of more like community-centric conversation about determination and boundaries and territory and borders is really kind of the way forward in my mind. As somebody who's been, sort of looking at these borders and seeing how it affects even my family in terms of our movement back and forth between our relatives. Like, for example, there's certain things that I can't even bring into the country that are ceremonial, that I can't share with certain spaces because there's all these regulations about certain things that have to be in certain spaces that are determined by people that are not concerned with the way I engage different communities. And even though historically we see how things moved within this continent in particular, across Turtle Island, that's completely disregarded for these socio-political concerns that are being governed by European descent individuals who are not aware of or willfully ignoring the way that those relationships are kind of organized and set up. And so this is a very important conversation to be having today in particular, because we are looking at, an upcoming election where immigration is a hot topic. But then also we have things that are happening. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about Israel and Gaza and things like that, but there's there's issues of borders, there's issues of boundaries, there's issues of determination. There are issues of sovereignty that are at stake that I think are being kind of like washed to the side for the idea of the individual, as opposed to thinking about the communities and thinking about the the groups of people that are being affected, as opposed to like very specific particular concerns, when in reality it's something that should be collaboratively defined and something that should be collaboratively articulated and collaboratively enforced. And as an individual, our role is to acknowledge when we're the minority in that space, when we are a guest in a particular treaty land, when we are a guest here in Indian territory, of all these like different places, and how they themselves, the 39 tribes, are also, well, not all of them, but most of them are also themselves brought from another location and removed. So therefore, at some point, they were guests too. And so these kind of struggles and these shifting narratives, I think, are really crucial to think through. And I think that the world is almost like in need of this conversation, to think about determination and to think about who gets to decide that and to think about to what end. I think that we just are uncomfortable with the ways in which determination play out in our everyday lives. And the curator role is an interesting, almost like, I don't want to say low stakes, because there are stakes for sure, but it's like not quite as life or death as what's happening in the world. But there's definitely like a need to examine how we are enforcing arbitrary boundaries, or how we are even perhaps cementing lines in the sand that don't necessarily have to be there, and how we are ignoring other forms of boundaries that are actually great at allowing a flow alongside each other, that maybe could help us reimagine the ways that we're articulating a particular space or place.
Yeah, I was thinking about Val Napoleon, who's a Soto legal scholar, and she writes about the ways in which our ideas of self-determination are really impacted by the post-World War II, like reformation of nation states. Some of the research that I've done at Remai Modern is, speaking to language speakers and knowledge keepers who have an understanding of what self-determination means from within our own nation's contexts, right? And the idea of the self, although, depends on who you talk to, of course, but the idea of the self is something that is always in relation, right? So, and when you talk about self-determination, with some folks, they're going to talk about how the land is what governs us, and it's not the other way around. And so how do institutions who are occupying Indigenous territories come to wrestle with those understandings that are grounded in language and in teachings that are, much deeper and layered and complex than most folks have even really sort of begun to uncover. So that is something that I always try to bring into my conversations around self-determination, which are very present in museums in Canada right now. It's sort of where the conversation is going in a big way. And we need to keep those nation-specific knowledges sort of at the heart of those discussions, I think.
I'm also, if I may, I'm really glad you brought up the non-human agents that inform a lot of these parameters as well. Like I like that you brought in the land as something that has agency and has a presence and has the ability to guide how we determine boundaries and how we determine areas and arenas. I mean, literally. So it's just incredible to think about these non-human elements that tend to be left out of the conversation in favor of a more legalist conversation that's determined by courts of law, or the result of like war, as opposed to like thinking about the lived experience of the folks that are there right now and how they are relating to space and how they're relating to each other through that space. I think it calls for a lot more reflection, precisely because you have to become more humble about how you speak, because you are essentially in some way speaking for land, and that's not always like the best position to be in if you're not informed. And I think Indigenous knowledge ways help us because there's always been such a deep engagement with land in order to inform communities on how to talk about where they're from and how to talk about how they are from there and to talk about what they return to whenever they go someplace else. And so I think that this is really kind of a wonderful addition to the conversation about mentors and the conversation about guidance and the conversation about care when it comes to curation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought up this notion of humility. I think that's something that we as curators need to reflect on quite a bit more in the work that we do. And I also appreciate the ways in which I think for those of us who work in the field, we're very aware of how the work that we do inside the space of the gallery connects to life that is lived outside of the gallery. And I think at particular moments, there seem to be, we were talking about boundaries earlier on. I think there are ways in which we can work within institutions that don't always acknowledge the outside world. And you've both spoke about that relationship in these really wonderful ways that kind of like undermine those notions. Because we're at 6:02, I'm going to, my brain isn't working quickly enough to like meld these last two questions together in a seamless way. So maybe I will ask them to you in succession. So the first one is, so at this point in your career, I'm going to ask you to look back in like 20 seconds or something. Is there anything that surprised you that you learned through working in the field, or that you learned about yourself, or that you learned about the world around you in terms of doing this work?
Mm.
I think if I can jump in, I guess the endless ability to make it up as you go, like the room to just sort of like create your own path forward is something that I thought was only going to really thrive in the younger part of my career, but is becoming more and more crucial as I advance in my career. And that in particular has to do with like even being an adjunct curator now, a role that I previously would have not even considered or conceived of or thought of or even defined it the way that I am now. And then being able to use the position that I'm in order to create a different path forward in my career that may open doors for others, that may create different models, that may just sort of like, basically change the way we think about relationships, institutions, and the way that curators operate within an ecosystem of art. I think the ability to innovate is something that I not underestimated, but I knew it was there. I knew it's purported to be there. But I also I was surprised by how difficult it was to implement. But then I'm also surprised by how successful it is once implemented, which seems like counterintuitive. It seems very baffling that innovation is always a great lunge forward in the field, and yet we resist it to no end as a field. And maybe there's some wisdom there. Maybe there's like a effort to slow things down. Maybe there's a kind of caution to it. I could see that being, kind of like academia, how it moves slowly because of the weight of what it does and because of the way that foundations are hard to lay sustainably. But there are moments when it does feel very arbitrary. That resistance to innovation does feel very arbitrary, and that those are the moments to push. And that's where I think collaboration and community come into play. I think being able to kind of bring that weight and momentum and energy of your audiences and your communities that you engage in, even the artists and your colleagues, to push a new direction forward that in hindsight is successful, I think is really vital. I think this is where your mentors are really useful. I think this is where acknowledging all your different guides, including like non-human guides, become crucial. And I think that this is what informed even my position. I think it was through my community, through ceremony, through my own belief systems, through my human and non-human guidance that led me to a decision to just throw this whole random idea into the wind that ended up proving to be far more successful and even amenable to the situation that we find ourselves as an institution today. So it ended up almost solving more problems than causing them. You know, I thought it was going to be a like, Pablo, you're being crazy. I don't know why you're suggesting this. This is no. It turned into oh my God, this fixes 20 different things. We should do it. And it's something that we've never done before in this institution. It's something that I think a lot of folks are becoming increasingly aware of as a term. I mean, even the word associate curator was something that not a lot of folks knew in Oklahoma, believe it or not. You'd think that this is just regular terminology, but we don't really understand a lot of the jargon sometimes or what the roles entail. And it's interesting to see how there's a lot of work still to be done to educate people on creative ways to apply yourself in the field. It doesn't have to look exactly like it has in the past. It could change. It could be different. It should. And if anything, it should be welcome, and it should be at least considered as a possibility if you just like are willing to take a step back and have a less than comfortable conversation about what we've become set on and versus what it is that we can move forward to. And I think in a way, you know, boundary making is similar, where when you think about borders and you think about different boundaries and silos, we at the time maybe it solved the problem, but now it's up for maybe even just like re-examination in a way that could hopefully be beneficial for all sides of the boundary, whether it be between departments, whether it be between different institutional tiers, or whether it be between different roles within a setting, or in the case of the work that we do, whether it be just a reimagining of what we consider to be local or regional when talking about artists.
Mm-hmm. I love how you started the answer to that question because it's so true. And I think, you know, things that have surprised me, which are just such universal truths in a way. It's like, the more that you know, the more you know you don't know, right? But then also on the other side of that coin, you know, we often underestimate how much we know. And so, you know, I have really felt both of those sides of the coin very deeply in my practice. especially transitioning from living in Vancouver, where I lived for so long. You know, it's where I did my grad studies, and I was very like familiar with that community. It was a place that nurtured me in a lot of ways. And then like coming back to the prairies, which is like where I'm from, but into a community that I didn't know, into a new context, new community, like all of that really, you know, brought those two sides of the coin into focus for me. I'm in a new context where I like get to sponge up so much of the community knowledge, the histories of this place, and that, you know, sparks so much excitement, you know, endless new possibilities and ideas for things that need to be done in the museum. And it also, you know, re-grounds me in the fact that I am bringing something with me to the institution that is valuable, including things that maybe I developed and tried in places where I was before that didn't work out. And so it was like, oh, that wasn't the right thing. And then you kind of set it aside, but then it comes back to you and you're like, oh, you know, that it wasn't right at that moment, but here is this thing reemerging again, that has a lot of value and potential. So I feel like, you know, maybe it's being surprised by all of the different ways that knowledge circulates in the work that we do and resurfaces. And I think it is being, in some sense, allowing yourself to be guided by those signs and teachers in the world that are pointing you to the work that you should be doing and where you need to be. I mean, speaking of being an adjunct, I just moved home in November so that I could help care for my mom. And that was a decision that, you know, I didn't give a second thought to at the time, even though it you know, was potentially going to throw my life into complete disarray. And, you know, thank goodness the institution has been willing to like work through that with me and support me in that way. And right now it's like a 2-year contract, but it's a position that, you know, having this kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, which I think is kind of how I approach my work in the museum anyway, but in a kind of more structured, formalized sense. Like it holds a lot of promise if institutions can, you know, sort of let go of some of the things that they are precious about, which is like, you know, owning curatorial labor and ideas about being accessible and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's like the end of our talk and I won't get all into it, but I think that there's a lot of promise to be had in exploring these other models for how we move in and out of the institution, and it needs support.
If I may, Tarah and Sally, like I think also it's we talk about indigenizing institutions, and that does require consideration for family and community. And I think these positions that already exist can be rearticulated in a way that accommodates these values and into the institution in a way that really hasn't been seen before. Like I said, owning curatorial labor versus sharing the you know the person that brings that labor with their community and with their other connections, I think is very invaluable for an institution, because that's a direct pipeline into that access to that knowledge that then is able to be generated as a relationship, as opposed to just being like the formalities of a contract, right? Where it's relationship building and investment in people and their perspectives and everything that comes with that perspective. I think is really kind of the right step in the right direction. And that's very in line with Indigenous values. And I see how some of the things that are already there at the institutional legal level can be reframed to accommodate this project of indigenizing a museum.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. I I did mention having another question. I was going to try to sneak one in, but you have both touched on, I think in many ways, sort of what your hopes for possible futures could be within our field. And I'm also distracted because the room that I'm in, a dancer keeps walking by in regalia, so I need to leave to find out what is happening. But I want to thank you both very much for your time, for your thoughtfulness, for sharing us this insight into your practice, and for providing us with ways to continue to hopefully be thoughtful about the work that we are doing as curators, and the ways in which you've shown that, to put it very simply, that this work matters and it has resonance and it has weight to it. So thank you both very much again, and I look forward to continuing these conversations in other venues. And I'll just remind those who are watching that this conversation is being recorded and it will be posted to the Art Gallery of Guelph website, along with the 6 other conversations that took place in the cross-border dialogue series. Again, I'd like to thank tonight's speakers, Tarah Hogue and Pablo Barrera, as well as Nicole Neufeld, the community engagement coordinator at the Art Gallery of Guelph, who has just been really instrumental in helping us to stage these conversations, and Corinna Shelley, who has really been helping us out with the technical side of things. I was going to try to say her title, but I always give her a new title every time. But we really appreciate her help. And again, to the Art Gallery of Guelph and the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Guelph Community Foundation for providing us with the support for this. So thank you again to all of you who are watching, and I hope that everyone has a good evening. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Sally. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Pablo. We'll talk to you again
Well.
soon.
Yes.
Mhm.